Thank you, Andy. And yes, I'm going to try and distill a few of my thoughts around improving seed yield of herbage species. So first up, I want you to try and think of these things as storage organs of carbohydrate. So effectively, these little nuggets are holding a whole lot of starch, and that might give you a bit of a hint as to where the talk is going to go. So really, I don't need to tell you guys that growing more of these brings more money in your pocket. Okay, we can argue all day about the value of the seed, but generally speaking, at the moment, 100 kilos of ryegrass is $200, 100 kilos of white clover is $700. So that part of it's an easy sell, but how do we produce more of them? So tons of seed per hectare is all about seeds per hectare. Okay, generally speaking, seed weight doesn't come into it too much. That's coming down to the number of seeds we're going to grow. So there is a difference in ryegrass. So this is a ryegrass example, difference between tetraploid and diploid ryegrasses. But generally speaking, if this is all diploid data, it's a pretty straight line relationship between the number of seeds you grow, in this case per square metre, and the seed yield. There are six different cultivars in amongst that data set. So cultivar doesn't seem to make too much difference in this data set, and neither does the management of each of those trials. So there's numerous different trials. It's really hard to find seed yields this low, thankfully. So I had to go back to 86, to find some of that data. But we're after seeds per square metre. Okay, these are perennial species predominantly that don't want to give up carbohydrate. So this is ryegrass. So this is ryegrass that's been topped, and these are stems that come from the nodes. Okay, so each of these nodes wants to produce another stem post-harvest. Perennial species wants to regrow next year. This is where they want to store a lot of that sugar, carbohydrate, assimilate, whatever you want to call it, so that they can regrow next year. That is our big problem. Growers are really good at setting up their seed crops in terms of potential seed yield. So yeah, hopefully we'd all have ryegrass seed heads like this one. This one's pretty special. But this is what happens when they grow out in the sun on their own. Okay, so this is a ryegrass seed head. We do lots of good stuff to get lots of seed heads. So we close our crops at about the right time. We put adequate amounts of nitrogen on to produce 1,800 seed heads that we need for perennial ryegrass. So we do a lot of good stuff for ryegrass. I'm also going to talk about white clover. White clover is a little bit different. That's a little bit stretched. But white clover is difficult because we produce leaves at the same time as we produce flowers. So grasses are easy. Through stem extension, we produce a seed head on the top. It can sit in the sun, can do a lot of good things. Clovers, we produce leaves in order to be able to get flowers. So if we don't get leaves, we don't get flowers. The leaves become the problem in this sense. So I thought I'd go back to some basics and look at how you can increase the number of seeds, because in ryegrass, the number of seeds you're going to get is going to be influenced by how long they can grow for. So seed growth, let's call it growth, is fixed in thermal time. So generally speaking, we're going to be somewhere around 550 degree seed days. Temperature drives the timing from flowering to seed maturity. Okay, and then in cereals, we have a dry down period on top of that, and it drifts out to about 700 odd degree days to harvest. In ryegrass, constant dry weight, time to cut. Okay, that's about 40-ish% seed moisture content. So the duration is fixed. We can't really change that. The weather will throw whatever it throws at us. What we can and may be able to change is some of these other bits inside here. So most of the seed weight is put on during this time, the duration of growth. So there's a lag phase at the start, pretty much a linear phase of growth, followed by a plateau. Okay. If we can change the slope of that, we can increase the final weight of that seed. Or if we could change this. So generally speaking, in cereals and when we dwarf things, we decrease the size or the length of the lag phase. So we can extend the period of growth and end up with larger seeds. So that's a challenge for you guys. See if we can do that. That was achieved in cereals through dwarfing and stem shortening. So we can do the same or similar things in ryegrass with PGRs. But ultimately, the way we're going to increase seed yield is to either increase the rate of filling. The duration of the overall thing is fixed. We can't change that. So we're either going to increase the rate of filling or we're going to increase the slope of this phase. Okay, so we're going to finish at a higher weight. What we're going to see is either more seeds per floret in a white clover scenario. This could be any legume, okay? We're going to end up with a similar number of seeds or more seeds. Or we're going to end up with more seeds per spikelet on a ryegrass. Okay, and this is where it starts to get a little bit different for these two species or two types. Call them types, call this legumes and grasses because this could be any grass. Inside here, we're going to produce a certain number of seeds per spikelet. Okay, so the weight of these is going to be slightly different. They flower from the proximal seed all the way up to the distal seeds in order that they differentiated. So these ones always flower earlier, they always end up being bigger. The challenge for us is to try and get 2 or 3 of these seeds in the middle to make it into the bag. In a legume, there's not really a change in seed weight. We abort seeds to try and maintain a constant weight. So if you think about peas, there's no real drop off in the side of a pea and a pea pod. Okay, peas are a whole lot easier to see than white clover seeds. So generally speaking, we will start aborting seeds, and often in white clover we only harvest 2 seeds per floret. That's about what we end up with to get 1,000 kilos of seed. In ryegrass, we harvest roughly 1 seed is worth about 900 kilos, 1 seed per spikelet. So this scenario, we're pretty constant for a start. Once we get to about 1.5 seeds per spikelet, this increase seems to be reasonably constant. That's data out of some PGR trials. So 1 seed per spikelet is worth around about 900 kilos of seed per hectare. The problem in grasses is that these seeds vary in size. So this is the seed position from the rachis. So I've put up the picture of the spikelet. This is the seed closest to the main stem of the ryegrass seed head, the rachis, heading all the way up to the end. So if we could get 10 of these seeds, it's going to be about 9,000 kilos of seed per hectare. Okay? Oh, unfortunately, we follow trends like this, where anything that's below that line doesn't really even make it in the bag. Okay, so for a diploid ryegrass, this is Samson, I gather, yep. Samson, we need 1,000 seed weight of somewhere around 2.1, 2.2. So we're only going to harvest maybe 3 in this example, 3 seeds per spikelet that are going to make it in the bag. All this carbohydrate that's now stored as starch is effectively wasted. Okay, so we need to try and take this little bit, that doesn't sound like much, but there's about 2,000 kilos of seed sitting there. That's too small. There's another 1,200 odd kilos of seed sitting there that's also too small. So this is an issue we have partitioning carbohydrate. Okay, so ultimately here, if we could increase the number of spikelets and not necessarily the number of seeds per floret, we could make some real changes. So the number of spikelets per seed head is driven primarily by when those heads differentiate initially, so the day length at what time they go reproductive. So things like nui, if you can plant it a little bit earlier, go reproductive right now. So the shorter the day length, the more spikelets it's going to have when it triggers the reproductive. If it was planted later, goes reproductive in September, it's going to have less spikelets at that point in time. Bear in mind, we're probably not ever going to change this. We're only ever going to get 2 or 3 per seed head. This is, go back a wee while, right back to when I started at FAR. We had Jason Prathui doing some carbohydrate analysis of ryegrass. So this is the numbers he came up with of water-soluble carbohydrate sitting in roughly these parts of the seed head at harvest. Bearing in mind that at harvest, all the soluble carbohydrate here is converted to starch, so there's lots of carbohydrate, it's just not water-soluble at this point, and we need water-soluble carbohydrate to be able to move it around the plant. The rest of it's pretty much fixed where it's going to be. This is the amount of carbohydrate that sits in the stem, in the internodes of ryegrass at harvest. So there's enough sugars here that we need to be able to push them this way, but naturally they want to regrow from all of those nodes. Okay? They want to branch out and produce another plant. That's the perenniality of ryegrass. What we can do as growers is look at reducing the stem length of our ryegrass. So this is, again, some PGR work where we severely shortened some ryegrass from about 1 metre down to just under 60 centimetres. Every centimetre here is worth 68 kilos of seed. Sorry, 58 kilos of seed. $120 a centimetre. Okay, this is a mechanism that we can repartition some of this carbohydrate out of the stem into the seed head. So the shorter stems, just like in cereals, they influence the shape of those seed growth curves. And we can pull, because we need to be able to pull more carbohydrate out of here. There's plenty of source. We need a bigger, physiology term, sink, to be able to draw that carbohydrate out. That means that we can't have anything like this in our crops. Okay, so this is a cocksfoot example of stem rust. We have to be able to transport sugars around the plant. Okay, so some basic stuff that generally we do pretty well. Legumes and white clover are no different. Okay, so this is an example of how we might want to try and move carbohydrate around white clover. So if we can get the seed heads sitting in the sunshine, okay, they can grow really well. Okay, they are photosynthetic themselves. They do go green. They do produce sugars. They do a good job of trying to produce their own seed. But if they are sitting under a large canopy, they often will abort flowers, or as a minimum abort ovules, and therefore have less potential seed sites. So when it's shaded, and unfortunately there's not a lot we can necessarily do some seasons, like the one we've just been through, we see the seed heads are a small sink for carbohydrate. They don't get themselves going, and often they end up aborting. And unfortunately that's something that happens. So in terms of white clover, we've got to try and get the flowers into the sunshine, hence we grow things in wide rows. But you could say this about any of the legumes. Could be red clover, we want the flowers in the sun. Could be peas, we want the pea flowers and the pods in the sun. Peas would be easier because they don't often have these things. Yeah, they might be leafless or semi-leafless. So some conundrums that we get ourselves into is we often go topping white clover, to try and get flowers in the sun. But this is a developing flower after it's been topped in a relatively wet season of 2006, I think, or 2008. You can tell it's wet because there's a whole lot of pepper spot on a whole lot of these white clover flowers. But these flowers where we top these, all abort. Okay, so when you cut the carbon source off, the leaf that would have been on the top of there, these flowers often abort. So it becomes a double-edged sword as to whether you should go topping white clover or not. Legumes have some other things to consider. The more bee visits you can get to a single flower, often the more ovules that get pollinated. So if you can get one bee visit, we often end up with 2 seeds per spikelet. If you can get 4 bee visits, you might get 3, and so on. So pollination becomes something that we probably underestimate in some legume crops. Legumes, unlike grasses, also have these things that like to eat them. Yeah, they're after nitrogen. They love to eat legumes. So we have to be really conscious of, these are thrips and red clover. Okay, this is a red clover thrip, and I can't remember, I think it was an onion thrip, but it could be a flower thrip. But thrips like to eat and rasp away at the florets of clover like that. And this is case bearer moth, which I think we need to be a little bit more careful about in terms of clover crops. Okay, I've seen more case bearer and red and white clover in the last 2 years than I had before, possibly because we knew what we were looking for in red clover, but these things eat individual seeds, okay? So these are more of an issue in these clover crops than the grasses. So I just want to throw some things out in summary, okay, that we are trying to get these seed heads in the sunshine as long as you can, right from when they're developing, okay? It's probably more important in legumes than what we are sort of emphasising it at the moment. The seeds require a close source of carbon. Okay, so the seed needs to be able to draw carbohydrate from something close to it. If we can get it closer to the source, then we're starting to make some headway. Okay, bear in mind the source could be the stem, which is also a competing sink, because it wants to store it for next year. Okay, carbon requires photosynthesis, and this is really something aimed more at the clover and legume growers. Okay, we do actually need water. We don't want them too stressed. But we need green area, okay, to produce. Yeah, photosynthesis doesn't work otherwise. So my thing for grasses is that we want to do some things as late as possible. Okay, we want to be looking to irrigate as late as possible. We want to be looking to cut as late as possible. Give those seeds as much time to grow and develop. And for legumes, we want to get the flowers above the canopy. Okay, but ultimately, actually, Chris might have hit some of the nails on the head. The low-hanging fruit this morning is getting this part done right. And that might be where I'll leave it. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Richard. Always food for thought when you speak. Any questions?
Are there any specific nutrients that can help that raw carbohydrate in the grass plant?
I don't know. I would love to know if there was, but you've got to, a lot of those carbohydrates and grasses are also quite long chain, so they're hard to move around the plant. Yep. So if we could break them into shorter chains, then that might be something we could do. I don't know.
Okay, one last question of Richard.
You talk about planting day here, Richard Chynoweth. If we're going to plant a ryegrass crop in, say, the spring for the following season, is that going to be beneficial?
So I mentioned planting date because the day length when things go reproductive can or does drive the number of spikelets they're likely to have. It's similar to what's in wheat. So the shorter the day length when they go reproductive, the more spikelets they'll have. So really you want, like Nui's doing its thing right now, it wanted to be fully vernalised back in mid-June so it can respond to the days as they start to get longer now. So it wouldn't matter if you planted it last year or in March, maybe April's getting a little bit late to be fully vernalised. That's not to say that a crop won't flower and go reproductive planted in June, because it will. It'll just be that those seed heads will be slightly smaller, and therefore to compensate, you'd have to have more of them or get more seeds per spikelet, which that bit doesn't seem to flow on. There are some things I could add for some plant breeders, but we can leave that for another day. Like they should be able to breed us some cultivars that have a flat number of seeds per spikelet, because they've done it twice. We have had Beeley and Commando, that both were high-yielding ryegrass cultivars, that had 4 or 5 seeds that were all the same weight. So that can happen. I've mentioned it to a few. Hopefully someone can pass that on. But like that happens in wheat. Like the first 3 or 4 seeds in a spikelet are the same. They're all fed slot by different plumbing, but I don't know in ryegrass. No one's ever looked as to whether they have different or the same plumbing. Not that I can find anyway. So like they feed off each other, and if we could get the first 4 seeds the same weight, we could potentially be back to those 4,000 kilo type yields.
Great. Thank you, Richard. Round of applause for Richard.